Hi, my name is Dennis, and this is a practical guide to CSS Grid. So, in this video, you will learn all essential things you need to know about CSS Grid that will help you get started using CSS Grid right now. So, you'll learn things that you'll end up using most often in CSS Grid. So, there is a lot more to it, but this will help you get started immediately. And in part two of this series, we will put into practice everything that we've learned, and we will be building a responsive image grid. So that is really exciting, and I hope you guys stay with me till the end. And while we're at it, I would also like to tell you about that I also have a course on this, a complete course, CSS Grid course, which is linked in the description below, where you can learn CSS Grid in depth. And perhaps the best part is the final project, where I put a lot of effort into it to make sure that you get a very realistic experience of building a commercial level project. So, and anyway, it's 30 days money back guarantee. So feel free to check that out. So in this short video, I'm going to try and pack as much information as I can. So if you get confused somewhere, please pause the video and watch it again, or you can ask me a question in the comments below. Okay. So now, first of all, what is CSS Grid? So CSS Grid it's a native grid system for CSS. It means that we can create rows and columns now natively without having to rely on a framework. Like traditionally we use something like Bootstrap or some other CSS framework to make rows and columns, right? But now we don't have to. We can make rows and columns natively in CSS. So which is really cool. So let's see how we can go about doing that. So first of all, we have a grid container. So we have a container, and this will be our grid container, and this will have a bunch of grid items. So in my case here, I will add I will add 6 grid items here, and I'll just give them each a name. Item 3, item 4, item 5, and item 6. All right, so we have 6 grid items here, and I have some boilerplate CSS here. Okay, so how do we create a grid container? So we'll select the class container and set its display property to grid, and we have a grid container. While we have a grid container here, now let me actually show you in our developer tools. So I'm using Firefox here, Firefox Developer Edition, because it has good CSS Grid debugging tools here. So if I go select our grid container here, and if I select it, you can see that we indeed have 6 rows here. So each of one of these grid items is in a separate row, and we also have 1 column here. So just to make it a bit more easy for us to see this, let me add some styling to it. So I'm going to use the attribute selector here, class that begins with item, and I'm just going to paste some CSS in. Okay, so that it looks slightly better. Okay. Now the first thing is that we will learn about how do we create columns. So in order to create columns, we have this property called grid template columns. And now with grid template columns, let's say we want to create 3 columns with 200 pixel width each. So the way we would do that is 200 pixel, 200 pixel, and 200 pixel. So by this, we have 3 columns now. Okay. So this is how we create columns. Similar to this, we can also create rows. So right now, as you can see, we already have 2 rows, and but let's go ahead and change the size of these rows. So we have grid template rows for this again. So let's add 100 pixel and 100 pixel. So let me hit save. Now you can see that our rows, now indeed we have a 100 pixel row height here. Now this is all well and good now, but if you notice that all these items are right next to each other, wouldn't it be nice if there was a way we can add a bit of a gap in between them? And there is in fact a way we can do that, and that is our next property that we will learn about, which is called grid gap. So grid gap, what this does is we can add a gap between the rows and columns. So this can take two properties. Let's say the first one is row gap, which is 10 pixel, and the second one is column gap, which is 20 pixel, like this. So as you can see now, we have a row gap and a column, separate row gap and a separate column gap. Okay. But now instead of doing that, what if we just wanted a it's equal gap? So we can just give it one property, 20 pixel. Now it has same row and column gap. So this is what grid gap does. Now so far we've learned about creating rows and columns, right? And we've also learned about what is a grid gap and how we can add one. But so far what we've done is we've had to specify each individual row or column, right? Like for instance here in our row here, so we've had to individually specify 100 pixel and 100 pixel. Like we wanted two rows, so we had to manually specify that here. So wouldn't it be easier if there was an easier way without having to manually write the same thing over and over again? In fact, there is a really handy function here we can use called repeat. So repeat, what this does is this takes two arguments. So the first argument is the number of rows or columns that you want. So in our case, we want two rows, and the second argument is the size. So in our case, we want our row to be 100 pixels in height. So let's hit save. And in fact, you wouldn't see any change, but in fact, it makes our life a lot easier when we have when we need to create a lot of rows and columns. So similarly here as well, we can also go ahead and change this into a repeat function. So we want here again, we want three columns here with a width of 200 pixel each. Okay. Now again, we have three columns with 200 pixels width. Okay. Now, so far you've noticed that we've been using absolute units here, but we can very well go ahead and use relative units here as well. So instead of specifying our width here to be 200 pixel, we can easily say our width should be 25%. So, or you could also go ahead and say the width to be, let's say maybe 5 rem. In this case, it would be 5 rem. So you can also use relative units here. And now I wanted to introduce you to a new unit in case if you have not come across, which is called FR, which stands for fraction. So I'm going to give this a value of 1 FR. So what this does is that it takes all the empty space within our grid container and it divides that equally amongst its rows and columns. So in our case, it took the empty space within the grid container and it divided that into three equal columns. So those columns have the same width, and FR stands for fraction. So this 1 FR is 1 fraction. And in this case, we have three columns. So in our example here, this is 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. So they are all equal in their width. Similarly, let's say you wanted to add a fourth column here. And by the way, you can also add another column here just by adding, let's say, another 100 pixel like that. You can add another column just like that if you wanted to. So you can mix and match repeat with other columns if you want to add them. So let's say we have three columns with 1 FR each, and we have a fourth column with 0.5 FR. So in this case, we have the fourth column, which is taking up half of the space as the other three columns. Okay, so this is what FR does. So once again, FR stands for fraction, and what it does is it takes up empty space and divides that equally amongst its grid items, right? Not grid items, but between the rows and the columns. So in this case, we have columns. So it has taken that space and divided that equally because that's what we wanted it to do, 1 FR, right? And 0.5 FR, we gave that to our fourth column here, and that fourth column is taking up half the space. Okay. Okay. So now that you know the basics of how to create a grid container with specified numbers of rows and columns, now let's briefly talk about positioning these grid items. Okay, that is another really important thing that you will end up using quite a bit when you work with CSS Grid. So let's say let's take our item. So our first item, item 1, and what do I mean by positioning grid item? So by positioning, I mean, let's say we have our item 1, right? We can move it anywhere within our grid. We can position it anywhere we want, which is really handy. So let's see how we can do that. So let's say we have item number 1 right now, and we want to move it around, and we want to move it in from the first column into the second column. Okay. Now, before we learn how to move that, let's briefly talk about what are grid lines. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and enable display lines here. Display line numbers. Now you can see that grid indeed has lines, and these lines are numbered. Let's take a look at columns first of all. So as you can see, columns here, we have line numbers. Like this is the first column line 1, this is 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay. Similarly, they also have negative line numbers, which begin from the opposite side, -1, -2, -3, -4, and -5. And rows also have line numbers 1, 2, and 3. Now, getting back to our example here, we want to move item 1 into the second column. So for that, we have this property. So for we will use grid column, and this takes two values. The beginning line number, in our case, beginning line number is 2, and the ending line number in our case, which is 3. Now as you can see, so our line number 2 and line number 3 here, and item number 1 now has moved into the second column. Another really cool thing is that let's say we want to span it across 2 columns. Let's say we want item 1 to take up column 1 and column 2. So we can also do that. Instead of beginning at line number 2, we can simply change that, say that begin at line number 1. And now you can see that now it is indeed spanning across 2 columns. Now talking of spanning, you can, instead of using line numbers, you can also use this keyword called span to, and it does the same thing. You can even say span 3, and it will span 3 columns. And if you are using this keyword span and you are not changing the beginning, as in where this item is originally placed, right? If you are not changing that, you can omit the beginning value and you can just say span 3 like that, right? Because we haven't moved the item anywhere, we are simply spanning it. So I can go back and change this to span 2. And like this, you can even do this for rows as well. Similarly, for rows, we have grid row. Let's take our first item and span it across 3 rows. But instead, let's first of all add another row here. So we have 3 rows. All right, so now we have 3 rows. Grid row. Let's begin at line number 1 and end at line number 4, or maybe 3. As you can see now, it is indeed spanning 2 rows. Not that, yeah. And if we wanted to move this to the next row, we can also do that. So let's say we want to begin at row 2 and we want it to span 2 as well. So in this case now we've moved item number 1 into the second row, and from the second row it's spanning 2. So like this you can mix and match and place items wherever you want in the grid. I know this is a lot of information which I have packed into this video. So just to recap, once again, what we've done here is we've learned what is a grid. We know what is a grid. Grid has grid items. We know how to set up a grid container, and we also learned about how to create rows and columns. We learned about the repeat function, which lets us create multiple rows and columns easily. And we also learned about the FR unit, which is a fraction unit. And then we also learned about positioning, a bit about positioning grid items using line numbers. Okay. Now in the next video, we will work on this project where we create a responsive image grid. Okay. So I hope to see you in the next video.